This podcast is about you. Are you ready? Take a moment and ask yourself, do I know the truth, and do I even care? Well, if you care at all, we have something for you. Stick around. We're a podcast that does not ignore the truth about life, people, or God. Larry Kutzler has been a pastor, a Bible commentator, a radio and podcast producer, and now is your host. This is a podcast you won't forget.
Your brain just wants what's familiar, right? You think about that idea that when you come back home from a long day at work and you pour yourself that glass of wine or two or three and you turn on Netflix and the next day you're like, oh, I know I probably shouldn't have done that. And then 5 o'clock rolls around the next day and you do the same thing because it's familiar, right? And we see that in the nth case to those that suffer with addiction. Addiction is, of course, there's a huge traumatic component there, but there's a familiarity there too. That's all your brain wants and desires for you as well, because its familiarity is safe.
The scriptures remind us about our thinking. The Apostle Paul said in Romans 12:2, "Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, His good, pleasing, and perfect will." The proverb writer says, "As a man thinks, so is he." I asked a buddy of mine the other day as he was staring off into the distance, "What are you thinking about?" His reply, "Nothing." Now, I can't imagine anyone not thinking about anything, but nothing in means nothing out, and so today I want to present to you a podcast done by Dr. Nathan Unruh on It Matters What You Feed the Brain. I think you'll find it challenging. Thanks for joining us for the City Sides Podcast.
This podcast is about ideas, concepts, and principles that come from the Bible. The influence from our culture has failed us, leaving us without hope. Today, hope is still alive with God. Thanks for joining us.
I'm here with Dr. Shananna Alibhai, who's been a good friend for a long time, and she has been busy. She is a doctor, a family physician. She is a mother, and she is also a speaker. And she's got a brand new book coming out real soon called Feel Better. And we're going to dive into that conversation about that book and what you can expect from that book. But before we get rolling too much here, Dr. Shahanna, tell our listeners today just who you are and how you got to this point.
Yeah, thank you so much for that kind introduction too. I always like to say, how would you introduce yourself at a dinner party? You know, that's called the dinner party test. For me, it might be, yes, I'm a doctor, mother, speaker. And that sounds great right at the forefront. But the much more interesting story, the much more real and authentic story is that all of this came to be when I found myself in the role of a patient. You know, that's when everything really changed for me. And I spoke about that in the TEDx talk I gave in 2019, really saying that I was a hypocrite, which I absolutely was. You know, mental health was a you disease. It was going to be about you. I would support you. I would advocate for you. I would prescribe medication for you. But I'll be honest, I felt I was too good. I was too privileged. I had too much education for mental health to penetrate this. And of course, that never works that way. And in fact, I think the more privilege, power, education you have, I think sometimes the more susceptible we are because we think we're invincible, right? And that's exactly what happened to me. So nothing like the postpartum time for everything that you've suppressed way down deep to find its roots again and start to really, really thrive in a negative way. And that's exactly what happened 8 years ago after the birth of my first son. And I found myself face to face with a reproductive psychiatrist at BC Women's Hospital going, how did I get here? Like, how did I literally get in front of a reproductive psychiatrist, not as a physician, but as a patient, going, here are my symptoms. And my husband, who was obviously a chiropractor as well, looked at the reproductive psychiatrist because I had a color-coded diagram of all of my symptoms that I had. And the psychiatrist looked at him and said, is she always like that? And he said, yeah, she's always like that. So, you know, I think there's nothing like me search in order to help you figure out what's going on. And I think the idea of blending, yes, my education as a physician, the stories that I hear from the youth that I work with a lot of high risk, vulnerable youth. and then my own stories, and then sharing them from the stage. And now they're packaged in this book. I call it the love letter that I write to these youth that I work with, because they have been vulnerable from day one. They haven't had the ego that I have had, and they've been courageous enough to share their story with me. And this is my love letter back to them.
So when you wrote this book, is that the audience, is the youth, or is it broader than that?
Really good question. Yeah. So I think no. And I think the audience really, and I think it's women. It is women. It's between the ages of, I would say, 35 and 55. I think it's the women that are going to hand it to the important men in their life and say, this is a book that you need to read too. It's for parents, but it's for people. The avatar really is that person who's trying to do it all. And the feeling is not anxiety or depression, it's overwhelm. And I think all of us can attest to that, right? The minute we say anxiety, depression, we're like, yeah, no, not me, I'm good. Overwhelm, of course. I think a lot of us feel that way. So that's who the book is written for.
Well, I'm looking forward to having you release it, because I know it's going to help a lot of people. I've read and been around you a long time, and you are full of a lot of wisdom to help us truly feel better. You know, I want you to pull apart this statement, and I think it's a great statement, and I think you can give some practical takeaways for those listening today, is that our brain is not meant to keep us happy. It's meant to keep us alive. Our responsibility to put practices in place or that happiness or that joy that we desire. So speak to that for just a moment.
That lesson took me so long to understand. I think some people go their entire life not really thinking that through. Your brain just wants what's familiar, right? You think about that idea that when you come back home from a long day at work and you pour yourself that glass of wine or 2 or 3 and you turn on Netflix, and the next day you're like, oh, I know I probably shouldn't have done that. And then 5 o'clock rolls around the next day and you do the same thing because it's familiar, right? And we see that in the nth case to those that suffer with addiction. Addiction is, of course, there's a huge traumatic component there, but there's a familiarity there too. That's all your brain wants and desires for you as well, because its familiarity is safe too. And I see this in my youth as well, right? They'll be drinking out with their friends because it's safe and familiar. So for me, it was this idea that a lot of the time your brain is lying to you. They did this beautiful study where they took some people on a train. Half they said, go read a book, do your own thing, that's fine. And the other half, go sit next to somebody and do the thing we all don't want to do, start up a conversation. Mm-hmm. Everyone said that the conversation group is going to feel a lot worse because they don't want to do that. Guess what? They felt a lot better. So that feeling of like, I don't want to go to that dinner party, I don't want to go socialize, your brain actually lies to you and keeps you from the things that actually bring you the most joy. We know that those habits that are worthwhile in the long run, the threshold, the ramp actually takes a lot longer to get going. Think about exercise, thinking about having a healthy diet too. So all of this takes training, and training takes habits, and habits take consistency too. And I call it the Cinderella principle. Every night, the clock resets, right? So you can do a great job of being self-aware one day, and the next day you absolutely suck. And that's okay. That's the way that it should be. So replace this feeling of perfection with a sense of curiosity. That is what we've lost in adulthood. I look at my 3 young boys. They're constantly curious. And think about this. Kids laugh 400 times a day. You know how many times adults laugh in a day? 14. Mm-hmm. So we've not only lost our laughter and joy, but we've lost this sense of self-discovery because we're too busy hating ourselves.
So what are some practical tips that you teach people? Yeah. You know, give us a little insight into what we're going to learn in your book when we read it.
Absolutely. So I call it the 4A model. And this honestly came from one conversation with a 17-year-old. And this was his claim to fame in the office with me. He told me, he's like, Dr. Alibhai, he's like, my friends come and they trust me when they use drugs. I said, okay, tell me more. He said, yeah, he's like, I'm so good at all of the science behind the drugs that if they mix different things, I'll tell them, yeah, you can mix these, but you can't mix these. Really hard to know how to respond to that as a physician. Like, first of all, I'm thinking, this is not a good path we're going down. But I took an alternate approach and I looked at him and I said, I can really tell that your friends trust you, and not only trust you with their drug use, but trust you with their life. I said, that's got to feel like a really important role. This kid stood up a little taller, shoulders went back and go, I never thought about it that way. Because you see, he was testing me. He was testing me to see, I'm going to be like any other physician and say, don't do substances, which of course is the ultimate message. I get that. But I tried to take a bit of a different approach too. So what did I do there? I did the first A, which is acknowledge. However horrible and difficult your background has been, and I've seen a lot of them in the youth, my job for them and for all of you is to say, what are you carrying on that invisible chalkboard? We've talked about that before. What are the things that you're carrying from work to relationships to finances? And the idea being that if you start to share those, it's called the beautiful mess effect. It's a psychological principle that says if your team or people you love know, like, and trust you, and you share something vulnerable about yourself, they don't like you less, they like you more. So in this age of in authenticity, use this to your advantage. Most people listening here are leading a team. I'm assuming you guys have a team under you. I'm not saying to spill everything that's in your past, but start to use this psychological principle of the beautiful mess effect to your advantage. Tell them something that's vulnerable to you. And guess what? You are going to know more about your team and you're actually going to be feeling more bonded. So the first one is acknowledge. Acknowledge how far you've come and acknowledge your past as well. The second one is awareness. And we've talked about that too. How do you build better self-awareness? And the one word there is curiosity versus self-hatred, right? You do something, you're like, oh, see, I knew I was going to screw up. I knew I was going to do badly, right? Instead going, why? What led me to do that, right? There's a whole chapter in that, but the essence is trying to be more curious about yourself. But everybody focuses on self-awareness. You can't be self-aware if you hate yourself, because all you end up doing is knocking on the door of self-hatred. That's why acknowledgement comes first. That's why even in this case of the drug abuse, there was something there that he could stand a little taller. The favorite words I tell the kids I work with is, I am proud of you. 5 words. More powerful than any medication I could give them too. So acknowledge, awareness, and then guess what? It's to accept. Accept that you feel envious, accept that you feel jealous, accept it. Because if you don't accept it, even for the split second, all you're doing is you're suppressing it. And we all know how that story turns out. By accepting the emotion, you're able to let it go. But we're so convinced that if we accept something negative, that means we're negative. If I accept that I'm jealous of you, that I'm a horrible person. No, it doesn't work that way. Emotions are energy and motions. They're the same thing if you go surfing. There's a crest and then a fall. That's the same thing with emotions. And the last A is action. And I go through in the book, well, how can you can't change an emotion. You can soften it. So how do you soften an emotion? And the first way that you do that is through your body, because that's what you have access to.
I want you to speak to the number of emotions. Sometimes I think that we only lock into certain emotions, but yet there's a lot of emotions. And I think you're so right. That acknowledge and awareness and acceptance piece is a big deal.
Yeah.
But speak to the number of emotions that we really have.
Yeah, there's like over 3,400 different types of emotions. But they did a study once and they said, well, can you name how many emotions? And guess what the average American named? 3: mad, sad, and glad. That's like tip of the iceberg. So no wonder if we don't, it's like it's the limits of our language, basically. Brene Brown is familiar for saying that if you don't have the adjectives, if you don't have the bandwidth, how do you explain the fact that I'm actually not angry? I'm frustrated. I'm actually not disappointed. I'm fill in the blank, right? Those are very different. And that's teaching our kids that from an early age, because we just become narrowed down that everything is frustration, everything is anger. Well, it's actually not too. And I think that's where the curiosity has to come in. And we have to realize that you can hold space for multiple different emotions. You can go in your day and you can feel joyous and you can feel delighted, but you can also feel disappointed. So I call it the emotional sandwich. Give yourself bandwidth to feel lots of different things. One of the things I love to say is that we don't suffer from an epidemic of anxiety. We suffer from an epidemic of not being willing to feel anything at all. That's what the epidemic is. It's not anxiety, it's numbness. It's that I'm not going to feel at all. Like that is a number one thing that I see in my office. Oh, I'm fine, I'm good. No, you're not. You've got cognitive blunting, right?
Mhm.
And I can attest to that because that's how I felt and sometimes still do.
Speak to that about numbness, because I hear that a lot myself of I'm fine, like you said, or I'm just numb, or we create habits to create that numbness.
Mhm.
Why? Why is that?
It's an armor. It's a great armor. It will serve you well for a long period of time because think about it. How many of us are sitting down and really thinking about there's a great book, like What Happened to You, right? Emotions are not just biology, they're biography. They're biography. They're what happened to you as well. You didn't come out of the womb and say, I'm going to suppress my emotions. That's what I'm going to do. You learned it from and this is no blame to any parents or coaches or people.
Yeah.
You learned it from the people around you. So when you think about when you get into a fight with your spouse, for example, what do? Does that sound and look familiar to what your parents did? And if it didn't, maybe that's taken a lot of conscious work to reframe that path. A lot of this is what we've seen and heard with our own ears as we've grown up as well. So I think emotional literacy is less about doing and more about undoing. It's more about undoing the patterns that you subconsciously have. And that's where I think it can get in a world that's already so busy. It's like, I don't want to do this. This sounds like the Friends episode with Monica's really messy closet. I don't want to look in that. Like, that's not fun to me. But there's a beautiful saying is that, we get so worried about opening Pandora's box by doing all of this. Guess what? You're in the box. You're not operating outside of the box. You're in all that stuff, right? So you have two choices in your midlife, either face it or reap the repercussions of it.
So as you look at a day, there's a lot of discussions about how should we take care of our bodies and how should we eat and take care of the different organs. But just now in the last 5 years, maybe, we're talking more and more about the brain.
Yep.
Which I'm glad we are because it's the organ in our body that controls everything.
Yeah.
So what are some things that we can do each and every day to help our brain, to help us become aware of those emotions and regulate those emotions and be okay accepting those emotions?
Yeah, I love it. So one of the things we have to think about too is that we get so focused on regulating, and I think we need to think about it as building our emotional capacity, right? That whole glass half full, glass half empty. We know that your emotional capacity goes down with stress. It goes down with a poor night's sleep. It goes down with chronic pain or pain of any sort. So how do you start to build that glass so you become more emotionally flexible? Here are 3 things that you need to know that every emotion leaves you. And if you think about it this way, now you have maneuverability. You have a way to soften your emotions. So just the other day, I'll give you an example. My eldest got into a little bit of a tiff with my husband, typical 8-year-old with that. So they were having a disagreement and I sat him down. I said, Ishan, there's 3 things your emotions leave you. Number 1, sensation in your body. This was something about getting, a video game taken away from him or something like that. So he's like, yeah, my chest hurts. I feel like my palms are a bit sweaty. My shoulders are up towards my ears. So use this in your daily practice. When you talk about numbness is also this idea from dissociating from our body. So understanding the first S pushes against the feeling of numbness. So get into what is this thing? Don't even try to name it. If you can't name the emotion, that's fine. What is it doing in your body? We've all become so dissociated from that. That's the first S. The second S is what is the story you are selling yourself? You're not telling it to yourself. You are selling it to yourself in your head. So whatever that story happens to be, I should have gotten that video game. I didn't do anything bad. You just fill in the blanks, right? And most of the time, that story, you are the hero in that story. At least I hope you are, because you're trying to sell yourself that, look, everything is happening against me. Ask yourself, is this story serving you? It is partly. Your job is to be the detective and go, actually, 50% is not serving me well. A great example I give is I go around the house picking up all the laundry, cleaning up, and I'm like an ogre woman, like walking around. I feel like it serves me really well because I'm the heroine in my story. I'm the poor damsel that's doing all this stuff. But is that great for my kids to watch me huffing and puffing and cursing under my breath? Probably not, right? So that's the 50% that it's not serving anybody else well. The last S is significance. Why the heck do you have that emotion in the first place? If it didn't hurt, if it didn't sting, you wouldn't have that emotion. If you go to a party and people start throwing a bunch of plastic bottles in the garbage, and if you didn't have something against climate change and were worried about that, you'd be like, okay, what the heck, I'm fine. But if you've had a mind for wastefulness, you're going to go, don't you do that, recycle it, or, find a different option. It has to sting in order for you to have the emotion. Sensation, story, significance. Those are the 3 S's. You need to unpack each one, or at least put thought towards each one to soften it, to go, oh yeah, that's the story I'm telling myself. Oh yeah, I really care about such and such. That's why I had the emotion in the first place. When you do that, suddenly the intensity goes from 9 out of 10 to 7 to 6 to 5 to 4. And next time you run into that emotion that causes you that sting, you've already acknowledged it, right? So those are the 3 building blocks that you can now take away to go, I have a way of tackling my emotions versus just, how do I feel right now? I'm not a journaler and that's never going to be me, but this gives you a template.
So what I'm hearing in that is that we have to be intentional with reflection.
Absolutely. Yeah.
As a habit, how do I spend time being more intentional on my reflection?
Don't expect to do it in the moment. The 1 S that you can do in the moment is sensation, right? Because that's often the one that is going to come to mind if you are body aware. That's where there's breathing techniques. That's where there's tapping techniques. That's where there's grounding techniques to help you in the moment decrease the sensation. The only reason you're going to be intentional about anything in life, including this, is if it pinches. If you see the negative repercussions in your relationships, in your work, in your finances, and you're like, you know what, I got to do something about this, then you'll find a reason to be intentional. Up until that point, up until my nose was right into the ground of you better deal with the stuff that you've suppressed for so long, I didn't want to do anything about it because there's always something better to do. Mm-hmm. So don't look at it as being intentional. And because I think a lot of us are not that noteworthy, I think you need to think about the cost. What is this costing you? And if it is costing you something, then find a way to make the time when you're driving is a great time to go, okay, let me be honest. What is the story I'm telling myself? And just stop there. And then why does this sting me? Why does this bother me? Stop there. And then you can do it for 3 minutes, 5 minutes, have your partner or someone help you. But every time you butt up against that, think about the cost that this is having in your life.
Give us one of those techniques. I know you'll have a bunch of them in your book, but teach us one of those techniques that we can use in the moment. So when they get done listening to this, what's a technique they can start using immediately?
Yeah. My favorite that I'm using these days is the squeeze and release, because I drive a lot for the kids, right? And got 3 kids in the back of my car. And so you're just taking the steering wheel and you're squeezing and releasing, squeezing and releasing. So that's a form of, that's kind of like breathing, grounding, anything where you're increasing muscle tension and then relaxing. It's the same way that animals in the jungle kind of shake their tail and shake it off. That's a way for them to rid excess, whatever you want to call it. It's why Taylor Swift wrote the song Shake It Off. So you can either shake it or you can squeeze it. And I like the squeeze because nobody knows you're squeezing the steering wheel and releasing it, but it actually works really well. And it's something different. A lot of us know about breathing. A lot of us know about tapping techniques. The squeeze was new to me. That's why I wanted to share it.
Beautiful. Awesome. Well, how can they find your book? And how do they learn more about you? What's the best places that people can go to learn more about you, hire you to speak? I know you're doing a lot more speaking for a lot of organizations and people. Tell our listeners where they can learn more about you.
Absolutely. So one of my favorite platforms is LinkedIn. Come follow me there too, as well as YouTube. I think YouTube takes a certain amount of courage. So I've posted my stuff on YouTube and it's getting a great response. It's raw, it's authentic. So come join the conversation there. Find me on my website at drshahanna.com. You can pre-order the book. We're going to have lots of cool bonuses that go along with pre-ordering the book, including quotes and beautiful graphics. One of my favorite quotes from the book is, "I see myself as a person with potential," from an 18-year-old boy whose mom was in rehab and dad was in jail. And That's the quote he came up with. And so people who get the book early are going to get a beautiful print of some of the quotes from the book. So you can pre-order the book on my website as well.
Well, thank you for this conversation. I encourage you all to go and follow Dr. Shahanna, and she's got some just great practical tips. I mean, we've been talking here for about 30 minutes, and there's already some things that I'm reminded of that I can do myself. I've had the opportunity to have a sneak peek at the book, and it's absolutely fantastic. So I encourage you all to go out to her website, get that ordered, follow her on YouTube. And Dr. Shahanna, thank you for doing what you do. It's great work. I know it's hard work, but I appreciate it, and I appreciate your friendship.
This is the City Sites Podcast with Larry Kutzler.
This isn't the end. It's only the beginning of your journey to trust God for the truth you never want to lose. We can help. Log on to citysitesurbanmedia.com today. Remember, there's only one truth and only one God, and you should know them both.